Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a fascinating and honestly highly relevant working paper from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. It's all about a hypothetical 2026 Iran war, and we're going to translate this rigorous economic scenario directly into what it means for your daily life and, more importantly, your wallet. We're looking at the real-world fallout of massive geopolitical disruptions, so let's get into it. So here's the big question. How exactly does a conflict happening 6,000 miles away manage to drain your wallet? It's so easy to see international news as just, something totally disconnected from our personal finances. But global commodity markets tie us all together. The Dallas Fed economists wanted to figure out exactly how a major disruption in the Middle East ripples through the entire global economy to hit your personal budget. To really grasp the impact here, we first need to track the timeline of events. The scenario starts with the sudden outbreak of a conflict in February 2026, specifically over a weekend when markets are closed. By March, things escalate dramatically. The Strait of Hormuz, which is absolutely vital as a shipping choke point for the global oil market, effectively closes down. Insurance contracts for tankers go through the roof due to the massive risk, and hundreds of ships just end up stranded. And here's why that matters. Closing the Strait of Hormuz pulls a staggering 20% of the global oil supply right off the market. 20%! That is not a minor dip, folks. That's a massive, instantaneous shock to the entire global energy system. When 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil just vanishes from international trade routes, the economic shockwaves are immediate and they are severe. The Dallas Fed economists really don't mince words about this. They outright call it the largest geopolitical oil supply disruption in history. To put that into perspective for you, this event would completely dwarf the historic oil shocks we saw back in 1973 and 1990. We're talking between 2 and 3 times as large as those previous crises. It's a totally unprecedented scenario, which means we need some incredibly robust economic modeling to even begin to understand it. So to figure out how this actually hits home, the economists used a pretty brilliant 2-step method. Step 1, they calculate the global oil shock using a complex simulation of the global economy. It's called a nonlinear DSG model, which basically factors in human expectations and downside risks. Then, step 2, they filter those global oil prices right through a US-specific inflation model, known as a monthly VAR model, to see exactly how that global shock translates into domestic inflation. All right, Section 1, the escalating scenarios of 1, 2, or 3 quarters. You see, the real wild card in this whole geopolitical crisis isn't just that the Strait of Hormuz closed, it's how long it actually stays closed. Looking here, notice how these definitive closure periods map out exactly when the supply chokehold releases. The economists modeled a 100% probability of closure for either 1 quarter, 2 quarters, or 3 quarters. You've got that quick resolution on one end, and then a prolonged, grueling 9-month blockade on the other before things even start to normalize. And as that disruption lengthens, you can really see the compounding danger to the market. Before this hypothetical war, oil was anticipated to sit around $60 a barrel. But if the closure lasts just 1 quarter, prices peak at $110. If it drags on to 2 quarters, we're hitting $132. And if we see a full 3-quarter disruption, well, prices spike to an agonizing $167 per barrel by October 2026. Just look at the dramatic spike for that 3-quarter closure, especially when you compare it to the much faster recovery if the strait reopens after just 3 months. Historically, prices hover around that $60 to $80 range. Then, boom, the crisis hits. That towering peak at $167 shows the immense, crushing pressure built up by a prolonged supply constraint before it finally drops off once shipping resumes. Moving on to Section 2, the home front and the U.S. inflation impact. Now, you and I don't buy barrels of crude oil, right? We buy gallons of gas. So let's translate this directly to the home front. Since crude oil makes up about 50% of the cost of retail gasoline, every single jolt in the global market gets passed directly down to your local pump. The rest of the cost is taxes, refining, distribution, the usual stuff. But because that crude oil share is so massive, any explosion in global crude prices practically guarantees an immediate explosion in your daily commuting costs. And the painful reality for the 4th quarter of 2026 is crystal clear here. A quick 1-quarter disruption pushes headline inflation up by a modest 0.35 percentage points. But a 3-quarter disruption, that causes headline inflation to surge by almost 1.5 percentage points. That is a massive jump, and it's one that directly and painfully erodes the purchasing power of your paycheck. We also really need to highlight the stark contrast between the wild, volatile swings of headline inflation and the slower, but honestly deeply concerning, rise in core inflation. Headline inflation includes everything, so it reacts violently to energy price jumps. Core inflation, on the other hand, excludes food and energy. It acts as a gauge for underlying economic price stickiness. And even without those direct energy costs, a three-quarter closure still pushes core inflation up nearly 0.5%. It just goes to show how higher transport costs eventually bleed into the prices of everyday goods. Check this out. Notice how headline inflation violently whipsaws into negative territory once the shock finally passes, while core inflation takes much longer to settle down. On one side, headline inflation shoots up and then completely plummets as gas prices crash back to earth. But on the other side, core inflation creates this sustained rolling hill. It proves that once transportation costs push up the prices of regular goods and services, businesses are much slower to bring those prices back down. Now, if we compare the actual inflation data with household expectations, we uncover this absolutely fascinating psychological insight about American consumers. Economists closely watch what households believe is going to happen. Why? Because if people expect high inflation forever, they naturally demand higher wages, which creates a really dangerous loop. Fortunately, while consumers definitely expect a tough year ahead, they don't believe this crisis will permanently unmoor long-term inflation, which is great because it avoids that dreaded wage price spiral. One-year expectations peak in a modest 0.61% increase in the absolute worst-case scenario. But looking out 5 to 10 years, the needle barely budges, peaking at just 0.09%. The public correctly identifies this as a painful but temporary geopolitical shock, not a fundamental break in the U.S. economy. Which brings us to Section 3, the twist, uncertainty and alternative outcomes. So far, we've only looked at clean, definitive closures, but human doubt plays a massive role here. If shippers are terrified of lingering military strikes, the oil supply won't magically snap back to normal overnight, right? Notice how these curves don't just drop straight down to zero anymore. Instead, they gradually slope downward. This represents the agonizingly slow return of confidence. Even if political leaders officially declare the Strait open, insurance companies and tanker captains might wait months to fully resume normal operations. And when you inject that uncertainty into the model, the economic fallout escalates even further. It pushes that fourth quarter headline inflation hit to a staggering 1.83%. Market fear quite literally has a price tag. It prolongs the pain at the pump, it delays the drop in consumer goods pricing, and it extends that inflationary squeeze on households well past the actual end of the physical conflict. As this explainer shows, global choke points literally dictate your cost of living. It leaves us with a pretty heavy question. If the unexpected strikes tomorrow, just how resilient is your personal budget? A war half a world away can reach directly into your pocket within weeks, driving up the cost of everything from your morning commute to the groceries on your dinner table. It's a powerful, maybe even slightly scary reminder of our deeply interconnected global economy. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the data.